It was the kind of mask you'd expect to find in some old, dusty antique shop, not in the attic of the house I had just moved into. The house itself was old, built in the 1920s, and had stood empty for nearly a decade before I bought it. It needed a lot of work, but I'd fallen in love with its charm and history. I'd grown up in an old house, and I liked the idea of restoring something from a bygone era. What I didn't expect was to find something as bizarre as that mask hidden away among the forgotten debris of the attic. I found it on the third day of cleaning. The attic was a mess, full of rotting boxes and old furniture covered in decades of dust. I was hauling out old photo albums and broken lamps when I spotted the mask in the farthest corner, tucked away inside a crumbling wooden chest. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a simple mask, probably a relic from some long-forgotten Halloween or masquerade party. But as I picked it up, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The mask was unsettling. It was made of some kind of weathered porcelain or plaster, with cracks spidering across its surface, giving it an unnervingly fragile appearance. The face was expressionless, almost featureless, with only the vaguest hints of eyes, a nose and a mouth, as though someone had tried to create a human face but stopped halfway through. Its lack of detail made it even more disturbing. The eye holes were large and dark, giving the mask an empty, hollow stare. The mouth was a thin slit, barely more than a line, twisted slightly upward in a way that suggested a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes you feel uncomfortable, like someone knows something you don't. Something about the mask felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. I should have just thrown it away, but I didn't. I brought it downstairs, intending to show it to a friend who was coming over later. I told myself it was just a harmless curiosity, a strange piece of history left behind by the previous owners. But deep down, I felt something else, a quiet, nagging sense of dread. Later that evening, my friend Megan came over. She was always interested in weird antiques, so I thought she might have an idea about where the mask came from or what it might have been used for. When she saw it, though, her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't laugh or make some offhand remark. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment, her face pale and uneasy. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "In the attic," I said. "It was just sitting there in an old chest." Megan didn't take her eyes off the mask. "It's creepy," she said finally. "I don't like it." I tried to brush off her concern, but the way she was looking at the mask was starting to get to me. She refused to touch it, even when I offered it to her. "I don't know," she muttered. It feels wrong. Maybe you should get rid of it." I laughed, but her suggestion stayed with me long after she left. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the mask, something I couldn't explain. I put it in a drawer, intending to forget about it. But that night, I dreamed about it. In the dream, I was standing in my living room, holding the mask in my hands. The room was dark, lit only by a faint flickering light coming from somewhere behind me. The mask felt heavier than before, its smooth surface cold against my skin. I stared at it, unable to look away. Slowly, the mask began to change. The cracks in its surface deepened, widening into jagged lines. Its hollow eyes seemed to grow darker, like the shadows within them were spreading. And then the mouth, the thin, twisted lines, started to move. It was smiling at me. The smile grew wider, too wide for a human face, stretching unnaturally across the mask until it became a grotesque, gaping grin. Then the mask started to whisper. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the words were soft and hissing, like a voice coming from far away. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head until it felt like my skull was going to burst. I tried to drop the mask, but my hands wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed, as the mask grinned at me, its whispers swirling inside my mind. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a long time, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. It had been just a dream, I told myself. Nothing more. But when I got out of bed, I felt an overwhelming urge to check the drawer where I'd hidden the mask. The drawer was open. The mask was sitting on top of the dresser, facing the bed. I stared at it, my heart racing. I was sure I had put it away, but there it was, sitting in plain sight, as if it had moved on its own. I didn't want to touch it, but I forced myself to pick it up and shove it back into the drawer, slamming it shut. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I must have forgotten to close the drawer, or maybe I'd taken the mask out without realizing it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Over the next few days, things got worse. It started with small things. Objects moving around the house when I wasn't looking. Strange noises in the middle of the night, like faint footsteps or soft whispers coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I walked past the dresser, I felt the urge to check the drawer to make sure the mask was still there. And every time I opened the drawer, the mask was sitting just where I'd left it, its hollow eyes staring up at me. The nightmares continued, always the same. Holding the mask as it whispered to me, its grin growing wider, its voice growing louder. Each time I woke up feeling more and more drained, like something was slowly sucking the life out of me. I started to dread going to sleep, afraid of what I might see in my dreams. But even when I was awake, the mask seemed to haunt me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always watching, always waiting. I began to see it everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my eye. Even when I closed my eyes, I'd catch glimpses of its hollow, grinning face, just for a second, before it disappeared. One night, after another sleepless night of terrifying dreams, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was done with the mask. I didn't care if it was just a coincidence, just my imagination. I had to get rid of it. I grabbed the mask from the drawer, barely able to stand the feel of it in my hands, and threw it in the trash outside. I felt a strange sense of relief as I closed the lid on the garbage bin, like I had finally rid myself of something terrible. But the relief didn't last. That night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like fingernails gently tapping against the glass. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was trying to get my attention. I turned toward the window, and my blood ran cold. The mask was there on the other side of the glass, staring at me. Its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and its mouth, the twisted, unnatural grin, was wider than ever, stretching across its face in a grotesque smile. It wasn't just a mask anymore. It was alive, and it was watching me. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. How was it there? I had thrown it away. I had gotten rid of it. But there it was, staring at me from outside the window, grinning as if it had always been there, waiting for me. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as the mask pressed itself against the glass, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Couldn't take it. I ran out of the room, out of the house, and drove as far away as I could. I never went back to that house. I left everything behind. My clothes, my furniture, even my phone. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I moved to a new city, changed my name, and tried to start over. But no matter how far I run, I can't escape it. Even now, in this new place, I can still feel it sometimes. Late at night, I hear that soft tapping on the window, and when I turn to look, I see it. Just for a moment, the mask, staring at me with its hollow eyes and twisted grin, still watching me. And I know, deep down, that it always will be. had always been wary of motels, but the desperation of a long road trip can make you overlook your better judgment. After a grueling 12-hour drive, I pulled into a small, isolated motel nestled in a remote corner of a sleepy town. The neon sign buzzing intermittently read, "The Willow Inn." I was late, and exhaustion made me willing to settle for anything. The check-in was uneventful. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with unkempt hair and dark circles under her eyes, handed me the key to room 15 with a curt nod. "Quiet night," she muttered, her gaze unfocused. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her, but I was too tired to care. Room 15 was as basic as they come. A small bed, a battered armchair, a TV that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, and a phone mounted on the wall next to the bed. The walls were thin, and I could hear the occasional creak and groan of the old building. I tried to push away the unease settling in my gut, telling myself it was just fatigue. I collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to even check if the sheets were clean. I set the alarm on my phone and tried to fall asleep. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rumble of distant thunder and the faint hum of the old air conditioner. I drifted off quickly, the day's exhaustion overcoming my anxiety. At around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of the room's phone ringing. My mind struggled to make sense of the situation. The room was dark, and the only light came from the weak glow of the street lamp outside the window. I picked up the receiver, but there was only silence on the other end. I listened carefully, trying to discern any background noise, but it was just a void of static. I was about to hang up when a whisper came through the line. It was barely audible, like a breath against the receiver, but the voice was unmistakably calm and soothing. "Are you awake?" I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the corner, but there was no one, just the dim, oppressive darkness. I hesitated before speaking, my voice shaky. "Who is this?" The whisper returned, softer this time, almost a purr. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." The line went dead. I sat there for a few moments, my mind racing. I wanted to call the front desk, but I didn't even know if they were awake, or if the call had come from somewhere else entirely. I tried to rationalize it as a prank or a glitch, but the unsettling nature of the call kept me on edge. I decided to try to go back to sleep, though every creak and groan of the building now seemed amplified. The phone's ring had left me on high alert, and sleep was elusive. I must have dozed off eventually because I awoke with a start to the sound of another phone call. This time, I picked up immediately, hoping for some explanation, but the line was silent again, filled only with static. I listened intently, and after a moment, I heard the whisper once more, closer and more insistent. "You need to leave now." My anxiety shot through the roof. I hung up the phone and tried to calm myself, but sleep was impossible. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of distant thunder and the relentless hum of the air conditioner. As dawn approached, I decided I had had enough. I packed my belongings quickly, eager to get out of the motel and away from the eerie phone calls. As I checked out, the clerk from the night before was gone, replaced by a young, disheveled man who barely looked up from the counter as he handed me my receipt. I couldn't resist asking him about the phone in room 15. He looked up with a vacant expression, his eyes betraying a hint of unease. "Phone's been acting up lately," he said. "We've had a few complaints, but it's probably nothing." I left the motel feeling a sense of relief as I drove away, but the phone calls and the unsettling whisper haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that went beyond mere coincidence. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to research the motel, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. I scoured online forums and news archives, looking for anything that might shed light on the situation. What I found was both shocking and chilling. The Willow Inn had a dark history that wasn't widely known. Several guests had reported strange occurrences and unsettling experiences, all centered around room 15. Some had heard whispers on the phone, while others described feeling an inexplicable sense of dread and paranoia. The most disturbing detail I uncovered was an old newspaper article about a tragic event that had occurred many years ago. A guest had been found dead in room 15, and the cause of death was never determined. The article mentioned that the victim had been receiving strange phone calls in the hours leading up to their death. The connection between the calls and the death was never explained, but the case remained unsolved and shrouded in mystery. As I read through the accounts and articles, that chilling realization set in. The whispers I had heard on the phone were eerily similar to what others had described. The voice seemed to be warning me, urging me to leave. But what if the warnings were more than just a haunting? What if they were a premonition of something far more sinister? The knowledge that others had experienced the same unsettling calls made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was tied to that room, something that reached out through the phone lines to torment its occupants. The sense of dread that had plagued me during my stay was now amplified by the knowledge of the motel's dark history. Even now, whenever I hear a phone ring late at night, a shiver of fear runs down my spine. The memory of that night in room 15 is a constant reminder of the strange and disturbing events that unfolded, and the chilling whispers that seemed to come from a place beyond the realm of understanding. The Willow Inn has become a haunting reminder of the dark and inexplicable, a place where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs into a chilling, disturbing experience. When I arrived at the small roadside motel, I was already exhausted. The past few months had been brutal at work, and I was on the verge of burning out. This trip was supposed to be a short escape, just a weekend away to clear my head before diving back into the chaos of life. The motel was nothing special, just a rundown place off the highway, the kind of spot you stop at when you're too tired to keep driving but don't expect much beyond a bed and a hot shower. The man at the front desk was friendly enough, if a little odd. He seemed distracted, fidgeting as he handed me my room key. His eyes kept darting toward the door behind him, but I figured it was just late, and he wanted to close up for the night. I didn't think much of it at the time. All I wanted was to get into my room, take a shower, and collapse into bed. I was staying in room 4, one of the few rooms facing the back parking lot. The motel was nearly empty, which suited me just fine. The fewer people, the better. I didn't want to be bothered. The air outside was heavy with the scent of rain, and a storm was rolling in, the distant rumble of thunder promising a long night. The room itself was clean enough, though dated. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the carpet had that musty smell you get in old buildings that haven't been renovated in decades. But none of that mattered. I wasn't there for luxury. I just needed peace and quiet. As I unpacked my bag and settled in, I heard something faint from the room next door. A shuffling sound, like someone moving around slowly. It wasn't surprising that there was another guest, but something about the noise was unsettling. It wasn't the usual sounds of a person moving around their room. It was too deliberate, too slow, like whoever it was trying not to be heard. I ignored it and finished getting ready for bed. The storm outside was picking up, the wind howling against the windows, and rain began to pelt the glass. As I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard the sound again, the slow, deliberate shuffling from the room next door. It was louder now, almost as if the person was pacing back and forth. The thin walls of the motel didn't do much to block out the noise, and after about an hour, it started to grate on my nerves. I debated whether I should go knock on the door and ask them to keep it down, but something stopped me. There was something off about it, something that made me hesitate. Instead, I turned on the TV to drown out the noise. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the low hum of the television and the pounding rain. I woke up around 2 a.m. to an odd sound, something I couldn't immediately place. It was a tapping noise, faint but rhythmic, like someone was tapping their fingers on the wall. My room was dark, illuminated only by the dim light from the TV. As I lay there, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, I realized it was coming from the wall behind my head, the wall that separated my room from the one next door. It was slow, deliberate, just like the shuffling from earlier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just the wind rattling something loose, but the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if whoever was in the room next door was intentionally trying to get my attention. I turned up the volume on the TV and pulled the blankets up to my chin, telling myself it was nothing, just a restless guest, someone with insomnia pacing their room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There was something too intentional about the way the sound carried through the wall. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I managed to fall back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal again. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was streaming through the gap in the curtains. I felt ridiculous for how unnerved I'd been the night before. It had just been the storm, I told myself. The sound of the rain and wind had messed with my head, and the guest next door was probably just an ordinary person. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I got ready for the day. I decided to stop by the front desk and ask about the room next door, just to ease my mind. When I got to the front desk, the same man from the night before was there. He looked even more on edge now, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with a stack of papers. I hesitated before approaching him, suddenly feeling stupid for making a fuss about a little noise, but I couldn't let it go. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Is someone staying in room 105? The man looked up at me, and for a moment, his expression was blank, like he hadn't understood the question. Then his face changed, and I saw a flicker of something, fear, maybe, in his eyes. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No one's in that room." I frowned. "Are you sure? I heard someone moving around in there last night, and there was this tapping." The man's face went pale, and he quickly averted his eyes, shuffling the papers in his hands as if he couldn't get rid of me fast enough. "That room's been empty for a while," he said, his voice shaky. "No one's supposed to be in there." A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. "But I heard." He cut me off, his voice low and urgent. "It's better if you don't ask too many questions. Just stay away from that room." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean?" But he wouldn't answer. He just waved me off, his eyes darting toward the door behind him again, like he was afraid someone might overhear. "Just leave it alone," he muttered. "It's nothing." I left the front desk feeling more unsettled than ever. Something was wrong with room 105, but I had no idea what. As much as I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive as far away from that motel as possible, I couldn't. Something about the whole situation had hooked me, and I needed to know what was going on. That night, the shuffling started again. I was lying in bed, trying to relax, but as soon as the sun went down, the familiar sound of slow, deliberate footsteps filled the room. This time, I didn't try to ignore it. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the wall. The footsteps were louder now, more insistent, as if whoever was in that room was pacing back and forth, waiting for something. Then the tapping started again, the same rhythmic pattern. But this time it was closer, like the person was standing right on the other side of the wall. I could feel the vibrations through the plaster, each tap sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed my room key and headed for the door, intending to go to the front desk again. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The door to room 105 was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to turn around and walk away, but I couldn't. Something about that open door drew me in, like it was daring me to see what was inside. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. I knew I shouldn't do it. I knew that whatever was inside that room wasn't something I wanted to see, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside the window. At first glance, it looked like any other motel room. A bed, a dresser, a TV in the corner. But then I noticed the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. The smell of something old, decaying, like rotten mold left to fester for years. I took a step further into the room, my skin crawling, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, crouched in the shadows, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. His eyes were hollow, sunken into his skull, and his mouth hung open in a twisted, silent scream. His hands were pressed flat against the wall, his long, bony fingers tapping rhythmically against the plaster. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, frozen in horror, as the man's empty eyes slowly turned to meet mine. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and fled the room. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the motel, not daring to look back. I never went back to that motel. I don't know what I saw that night or what happened in room 105, but I'll never forget the sound of those fingers tapping against the wall. I was on my way to visit a friend in a neighboring town, and after a long day of driving, I decided to stop for the night at a small, unremarkable motel. It was situated off a desolate stretch of highway, and the neon sign flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Exhausted and craving sleep, I pulled into the parking lot and checked into room 12. The front desk clerk was a disheveled man with a tired demeanor. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his eyes had a distant, almost haunted look. He handed me the key without much conversation, merely muttering, "Room 12, have a good night." I gave him a polite smile and headed to my room, eager to unwind. Room 12 was typical of its kind, basic and functional. The carpet was worn, the bedspread faded, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The only feature that stood out was a large, ornate mirror above the dresser. It was old-fashioned, with an intricate golden frame that seemed oddly out of place in such a run-down room. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too tired to care about the decor. After a quick shower, I collapsed onto the bed, hoping to get some rest before continuing my journey the next day. The room was silent, except for the occasional creak of the building settling. As I began to drift off, a sudden sharp noise jolted me awake. It was a faint, repetitive scratching sound, like nails dragging across a surface. My eyes shot open, and I listened intently, trying to locate the source of the sound. The scratching seemed to be coming from the direction of the mirror. I sat up, straining to hear over the steady hum of the air conditioner. The noise continued, but it was irregular, as if someone was scratching or tapping on the back of the mirror frame. I got out of bed and approached the mirror, peering at it with growing unease. The mirror was covered in a thin layer of dust, and its surface was smeared with something I couldn't quite identify. I wiped the dust away with my hand, but the scratching sound persisted, now accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whispering. The whispers were too soft to make out, but they seemed to come from behind the mirror, as if someone was trying to speak through the glass. I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. I checked the room for any other source of the noise, pipes, ventilation systems, anything, but found nothing. The room was as quiet as before, the only sound now being the low hum of the air conditioner. I decided it was just my imagination running wild, a side effect of exhaustion, and returned to bed. The noise stopped after a while and I managed to fall asleep. But the next morning, I found myself feeling strangely uneasy. The mirror still had that same layer of dust on it, but the whispers and scratching had left me feeling deeply unsettled. I decided to check out and continue my journey, eager to leave the uncomfortable room behind. As I packed my belongings, I noticed something odd. The mirror seemed to have a different angle. It was slightly tilted, as if it had been moved recently. I tried to adjust it back to its original position, but it felt strangely heavy, and the frame creaked loudly as I shifted it. I dismissed it as another quirk of the old motel and left, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. A few days later, after arriving at my friend's place, I couldn't stop thinking about that mirror. The scratching sound and the whispers had left an indelible mark on my memory. I decided to do some research on the motel, curious if others had experienced similar things. To my surprise, I found several unsettling accounts online. People described hearing strange noises and feeling an inexplicable sense of dread in room 12. Some even mentioned seeing ghostly figures or feeling as though they were being watched. The descriptions matched my own experience in disturbing detail. I delved deeper into the history of the motel and discovered something that made my blood run cold. The motel had once been a luxurious establishment decades ago, but it had fallen into disrepair after a series of tragic events. The most disturbing incident involved a man who had stayed in room 12 and had been found dead, his body covered in deep scratches. The cause of death was never determined, but the circumstances were deemed suspicious, and rumors of hauntings began soon after. The mirror in room 12 was an original piece from the motel's early days, and it had been reported missing after the death of the man. It was later found in a nearby antique store and had been returned to the room, though its exact history remained a mystery. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to contact the motel to inquire about room 12. To my surprise, the clerk who had checked me in answered the phone. I hesitated but eventually asked him about the room and the mirror. His voice was low and gravelly as he replied, "The mirror has always been a problem. We don't like to talk about it much. Strange things happen around it. People hear things, see things. We try to keep the room as quiet as possible. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried." I pressed him for more information, but he was reluctant to elaborate. He simply said, "It's best if you don't dwell on it. Some things are better left alone." Despite his warnings, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I continued to research, uncovering more accounts from people who had stayed in room 12 and experienced similar phenomena. Each story added a layer to the unsettling narrative of the mirror and its dark history. Months later, I received a call from a fellow traveler who had stayed in room 12 after me. They had heard the same scratching noises and felt the same oppressive presence in the room. They described a feeling of being watched and a strange cold spot near the mirror. Their account matched mine almost perfectly, adding to the growing body of unsettling evidence. I still think about that mirror from time to time and the scratching noises that seem to come from another world. The motel and room 12 have become a haunting reminder of that unsettling experience. I've never been able to fully shake the feeling that something malevolent lurks behind the mirror's surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest. The mirror remains a disturbing memory, a symbol of something dark and inexplicable. Even now, whenever I see an ornate mirror, I can't help but feel a shiver of unease, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind its reflective surface. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me on the road, taking a break from the grind of city life. I found this little roadside motel, an unassuming place just off the highway, the kind of place that seemed to promise nothing more than a bed and a hot shower after hours of driving. The neon sign flickering in the dusk seemed like the perfect haven. The check-in was uneventful. The clerk was a middle-aged man with a tired face, his uniform slightly disheveled. He handed me the key with a nod and a brief, "Enjoy your stay." There was something in his eyes, a fleeting shadow, maybe, or just the tiredness of someone who's seen too many travelers come and go. I was in room 9, a small, nondescript unit near the end of the row. It was dated but clean enough, with the usual array of furniture. A bed, a dresser, and a small TV mounted on the wall. The air conditioner rattled softly, adding a low hum to the otherwise quiet room. I was too tired to do anything but toss my bags onto the bed, run a quick errand to a nearby diner, and then crash for the night. The first night was uneventful. I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of highway traffic. But the next night was different. I woke up to a soft noise, like a muffled scratching or shuffling sound. It was faint but persistent, coming from somewhere outside my room. Groggy and disoriented, I lay there listening, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was strange, almost as if someone was moving around just beyond the thin walls of my room. I checked the time on my phone. It was 2:47 a.m. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just someone else at most, having trouble sleeping. I settled back into bed, but the noise continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. The sound of shuffling footsteps, faint and irregular, mixed with the occasional soft thud. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I got out of bed, pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and decided to investigate. The hallway outside was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb at the end of the corridor. I walked cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The noise was coming from the room next to mine, room 8. I could hear it more clearly now. The sound of shuffling followed by a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was unmistakable. Something was in there. I stood outside the door for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I considered knocking, but something stopped me. The air around me felt heavy, charged with an uneasy energy. Instead, I retreated back to my room, deciding to call the front desk to report the disturbance. But when I picked up the phone, I heard something strange. A faint rhythmic tapping on the line, almost like someone was tapping on the receiver from the other end. It was a peculiar sound, not quite right, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I put the phone down and decided to wait, hoping the noise would stop on its own. By the time I crawled back into bed, the noise had faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. I fell asleep again, but my dreams were filled with disjointed images of dark rooms and shadowy figures. I woke up the next morning feeling unrest, a lingering sense of unease hanging over me. The next day, I tried to put the previous night's events out of my mind. I spent the day exploring the nearby town, trying to enjoy my weekend getaway despite the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But when night fell, the discomfort returned. I decided to go to bed early, hoping to avoid any more disturbances. As I settled in, the same scratching noise began again. It was faint but persistent, coming from the same direction as the night before. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The sound was too unsettling, too deliberate. At one point, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, hesitant knock on my door. I froze, my mind racing. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the noise had come from outside my room, not from the adjacent room where the sound had been coming from. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no more knocking. I considered checking the peephole but decided against it. The last thing I wanted was to open the door and find something waiting for me. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but the scratching noise continued. I spent the rest of the night awake, huddled under the covers, listening to the unsettling sound that seemed to grow more intense as the hours passed. It was as if whatever was making the noise was getting closer, inching its way toward my room. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and on edge. I decided to check out early, eager to leave the motel and the strange occurrences behind. As I packed my bags, I noticed a small note pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway near the front desk. It was a handwritten note, scribbled in hasty handwriting. If you hear anything strange, stay in your room. Don't investigate. Don't open the door. The note made my blood run cold. It was clearly meant for guests, a warning of some kind. I glanced nervously at room 8, wondering what could be happening behind that door. When I checked out, the clerk from the previous night was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young woman with a tired face and a vacant expression handed me my receipt without a word. I asked her about the note, but she just looked at me blankly and said, "We take security very seriously here." I left the motel, my mind racing with questions. What had been going on in room 8? Why was there a warning to stay away? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong, something that was deliberately kept hidden. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the motel fading into the distance. The sense of relief was overshadowed by an overwhelming dread. The scratching noises and the mysterious knocking had left an indelible mark on my memory. I still don't know what happened in that room. I never found out what or who was making the noises, but one thing is certain. The experience left me with a profound unease, a lingering fear that sometimes the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. To this day, I can't help but wonder what I might have found if I had opened that door.